Um, Good morning. My name is Ian Wallace. I'm a senior fellow here at New America, and I'm the co-director along with Ross Schulman of our cybersecurity initiative. Before I hand over to Peter Singer to moderate this event and introduce the participants, I just want to say three quick things. Firstly, I want to give a quick plug for three events we have coming up in the near future. First of those is on Monday, an event on North American cybersecurity in collaboration with our colleagues from the Commerce Department and DHS and colleagues from Mexico and Canada, focusing on incident response, small and medium enterprises, and the global supply chain. And we're looking for that. Three separate panels, a morning event. Please come and join us if you can. Then, hot on the heels of that, on Tuesday, we are hosting Toby Feakin of Australia's Strategic Policy Institute for the release of his new paper on cyber security maturity in the Asia Pacific. So a round robin looking at who's up and who's down in terms of Asia Pacific cybersecurity. Again, should be very interesting. I hope you can join us for that. And thirdly, on October the 11th, we're holding an event in collaboration with the the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity, focusing on how cybersecurity at the state and local level plays into US national cybersecurity. Again, three panels, and we will be putting out more information about shortly, but details of all of those are on or will be soon on our website, so please go and have a look if you're available and interested. Secondly, I briefly wanted to say two quick words about our participants. Firstly, to personally welcome Thomas Red and congratulate him on his book. I very much enjoyed it, and I think you'll enjoy hearing more about it. But also to mention our fellows. One of the things we're most proud of on our cybersecurity initiative is our network of 25 cybersecurity fellows distributed around the country, working on different subjects relevant to the topic, but coming from very different angles. And so it's particularly pleasing to be able to put together a panel like this and be able to recruit three genuine experts, all of which are affiliated with us. So I'm very pleased to have the three of you. And finally, I want to give a proper introduction to Dr. Peter Singer. Peter is a senior fellow here at New America. He's also organization strategist. He has had a long career writing in the sort of defense, security space, particularly with a technology interest. After a long career at the Brookings Institution, where he was the youngest fellow, came here 2 years ago, and as well as having written perhaps the leading introduction to cybersecurity, Cybersecurity and Cyber War, Everything You Need to Know. He is also the author of Wired for War, which is a book on robotics on the battlefield. So he's extremely well qualified to take forward this panel. So Peter, over to you.
So thank you, Ian, for the very kind introduction, and for all of you coming out, as well as the people joining us online, appropriately enough, to this topic of rise of the machines, the past, present, and future of cybernetics, AI, automation, and cybersecurity. And as I was thinking how to introduce this topic, I was struck by the seeming contradiction that surrounds it. So, for example, Stephen Hawking, I think we can say one of the most brilliant people alive, has said, quote, "Success in creating AI would be the biggest event in human history. Unfortunately, it might also be the last." He warned that humans, limited by slow biological evolution, couldn't compete and would be superseded by AI. He's joined other brilliant thinkers like Steve Wozniak and Elon Musk and hundreds of others who issued a letter warning that AI could be more dangerous than nuclear weapons. And Elon Musk, for example, called the prospect, quote, "our greatest existential threat," end quote. And yet, at this year's DEF CON conference, one of the most exciting events in cybersecurity, besides the New America Annual Conference and Thomas's book release, was DARPA's Cyber Grand Challenge. There was, at the Hacker Convention, essentially a contest between automated systems where they competed in bug hunting tasks which would normally take humans months to do. And ultimately, it was the Mayhem system that took home the $2 million prize. And Mike Walker, the DARPA program manager who launched the challenge, described it as, quote, the beginning of a revolution in software security, in the same way that the Wright brothers' first flight, although it didn't go very far, launched a chain of events that quickly made the world a much smaller place. We have now seen for the first time autonomy involving the kind of reasoning that's required for cyber defense. That is a huge advance compared to where the cyber defense world was yesterday. So we have this, contradiction. Some people worried and queasy, other people excited. So what are we to make of this combination of AI and security? What's the history? What is the likely future? As we rely more and more on autonomous machines in our commerce, but also for our security, what are the benefits, the risks, and maybe most importantly, how can the public, how can policymakers keep pace? And to wrestle with these questions, we brought together a world-class panel of leading human experts who are going to explore the topic from multiple different perspectives, be it from computer science to political science, ethics, law, you name it. First, we're going to hear from Thomas Rid, who, as Ian mentioned, has a new book out, Rise of the Machines, A Cybernetic History. Very much recommend that you read it. Indeed, there's a blurb on the back, me saying you should read it, I think is almost the quote. But in addition to that, he's a professor in security studies at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Then we'll hear from Heather Roth. She wears many hats. She's cybersecurity fellow at New America, as well as a research scientist at Arizona State University. She's had extensive work on the ethics of AI, including with various United Nations conferences. And she's the co-author of a recent article in Wired magazine on some of the issues surrounding lethal autonomy and how the next president faces a difficult decision on that topic. Then we'll hear from Jason Hong, a cybersecurity fellow at New America, as well as associate professor of computer science at Carnegie Mellon. He's also the CTO of Wombat Security Technologies, which is a company that he co-founded that delivers software-based cybersecurity awareness and training. And then finally, we'll hear from Adam Elkis, who's also a cybersecurity fellow here at New America, as well as a PhD student in computational science at George Mason. He's a prolific author on topics that range from computational modeling to the ethics of robotics. So a great panel, looking forward to the discussion and soon involving you in it as well. So Thomas.
Thank you, Peter, for this very kind introduction. When we encounter new machines, I just did that actually last week. I came here via Palo Alto when I was at another small event. And I got myself this new machine, an iPhone. And
I was glad it was that. If it's the other type, they blow up, and so we're worried on that.
And when you do that, something strange happens. You buy this new machine, and very quickly the old ones appear rather outdated, and you see this funny hole that they have at the bottom of the frame, and you wonder what that was about. And so, I say this half jokingly, but there's a very serious point there, because when we talk about computers, about cybersecurity, about artificial intelligence, we tend to look into the future and expect the novelty, the really interesting thing. We always expect it to be in the future, sometimes in the near future, sometimes a little further away. And we tend to ignore the past. We tend to ignore computer history museums are only mainly visited by geeks. And we ignore the past, and especially we ignore the history of ideas that led to these new discoveries. So the perfect illustration for how we ignore this past, in my mind, is the history of the word cyber. Cybersecurity, cyber, whatever it is, cyber war. So I got this question quite often from students and colleagues, where cyber comes from, especially when it's abbreviated to one word, sometimes even to a noun. Are you interested in cyber, type of thing, which has different meanings in different parts of the country, I guess. But the answer was, not straightforward. So it turned out that it comes from cybernetics, which was essentially the AI of the 1950s. Everybody was talking about cybernetics. There was a huge hype about cybernetics at the time. And so I was almost a bit worried when I saw that cybernetics shows up in the title of this event itself. Because it's important to, so what is cybernetics, just very, very briefly? Cybernetics at the time was this idea that you could build a machine that has feedback, a feedback loop built in. So imagine your thermostat at your AC at home. The thermostat measures the temperature of the room and then adjusts the AC or the heating system to increase or drop the temperature, and then what happens is it creates an equilibrium. As soon as the temperature is achieved, the heater would stop, and then it would sort of bounce towards the target value, and you create an equilibrium. So that's a feedback loop. And in the 1950s and late 40s, people were fascinated by this idea that through feedback, you would create adaptation. And adaptation is essentially learning. So what you have here is a learning machine without any computing so far, just by feedback. And the second feature, the second theme in cybernetics was the human-machine interaction, human-machine merging. And the model that Norbert Wiener, who came up with the idea that he used, was a pilot in an aircraft, where the aircraft and the pilot form one system that interact with each other through feedback. And he said, conceptually, it doesn't make sense to distinguish between the machine and the human inside the machine. So why does this matter today? Well, if we talk about cybersecurity today and AI today, I'm sure some people here in the audience will think to themselves, how are these two things even connected to each other? They seem to be completely different themes. But I would say two things in response. One, AI implementations create cybersecurity problems, and cybersecurity problems can be partly solved by AI implementations. So, but historically, they have the same root. So for instance, one expression of that common history is very visible in the 1970s and 1980s. I think you'll cover that decade briefly just in a moment. But some of you may know this already. It took me a long time to find out, to discover when the word cyber war and the vision of cyber war was articulated first. A lot of people think it was in the early 1990s when the electronic Pearl Harbor was first articulated as a worst-case scenario in 1991. But actually, the idea of cybernetic warfare, and then abbreviated to cyber war, comes from the late 1970s and then gestated throughout the 80s in sort of semi-science fiction circles and even inside the defense establishment. And the idea was to have weapon systems that were autonomous, self-adapting, a little bit like the thermostat. Sometimes with humans bolted in that could wage war autonomously, and that was called cyber war. It had very little to do with computer network exploitation, as we call it today, or computer network attack. It was autonomous weapon systems made even more nimble through computers. And the cruise missile, which came up at the time, or the GPS satellite system, which also began to come online, then were illustrations at the time of that. So, we have to be very cautious. These expressions change their meaning rather quickly. So let me just make one final observation, and because I think this is supposed to be a bit of a conversational event here on the podium and also with the audience. In very early, 1948, if I remember correctly off the top of my head, there was this discussion between Norbert Wiener and one of his collaborators, also a cyberneticist at the time. You will know his name possibly, John von Neumann, a famous mathematician. Norbert Wiener also was a mathematician. And John von Neumann and Wiener had this dispute about the template, about how to approach cybernetics, how to think about it. And Wiener wanted to think the machine, if you like. Cybernetics was the theory of machines, that's how they called it. Wanted to think the machine from the human brain, from the human. He wanted to achieve, to build a machine that would be as innovative, adaptive, as sophisticated as the human brain. And John von Neumann said, this is not going anywhere because it's far too complicated. And he suggested to use a virus as a far simpler system that could be emulated through machines. Now, why do I mention this now, this virus versus human brain comparison? Because I think we like to make the same mistakes, just like when we buy a new machine. It's a very human trait throughout the history of the 20th century that we always project our hopes. And first it's hopes, and then also a little bit fears, but it's always hopes that dominate. We project our hope into the future machines that we build. We think they will completely improve our societies, the environment, the human condition. And Elon Musk, you mentioned earlier, I think is a perfect illustration of that. The vision that going to Mars could improve life on Earth, that fully automated driving would drastically change the way we transport ourselves. Some of those visions may well be true, but my point is, that's why I used that historical iPhone example, my point is we forget the visions that were completely off and wrong, and most of them are. Let's keep that very clearly in mind. We forget them. We only remember those who get it right. And I think we owe it to our own future that we also remember those who got it wrong.
Before I turn over to Heather, I should have added, if you're tweeting it, please use the hashtag #MachineRising so you can interact with other people online. So, Heather?
Thank you. So I really, I'm going to kind of work through my comments in relation to Thomas's work. So I highly suggest you buy his book. I was very much impressed by the work, the historical work done in this because of my own work in the area. My own work in the area is mostly on autonomous weapons, and autonomous weapons as not just robots, but cyber weapons are also increasingly autonomous. And most of my work is also driven by trying to understand the history and trying to understand how we got to where we are today. So sometimes, at least the last several years, you'll find me sitting in a very dark, dank room in Geneva, surrounded by very tired-looking diplomats. And they're trying to figure out what to do about lethal autonomous weapon systems. And they're talking past one another. Some of them say, the Terminator is coming. And some of them say, we don't have autonomous weapons. They're not here yet. And some of them say, drones are here. And you go, what? They're just talking past one another. And they're all coming to the conversation with some sort of assumption about what autonomous weapons are. And so, like Thomas, I tried to say, well, I'm trying to make sense of this, right? What's the difference between an automated weapon and an autonomous weapon? And how can I help these very tired diplomats make sense of this debate? And so my work has looked at all of this from the defense side. And when I traced back a lot of this history to cybernetics, to AI, to computing in the 70s, and really it was the 80s. So the 80s, at least in the United States, is amazing for computing, right? I mean, the rise of the personal computer did amazing things for us. But on the defense side, it was also, I would say, driven by ideology, driven by fear of Soviet Russia, and trying to understand how we can defend against communism. And what are the types of ways that you can defend? Well, one way that you want to defend is through speed. You want to get into your adversary's OODA loop, right? Your John Boyd's observe, orient, is it John?
John Boyd.
Yeah.
He was, by the way, reading Wiener and was inspired by cybernetics.
I know. It all comes together. So, the way that the OODA loop is observe, orient, decide, and act. And this was, how do you get into your adversary's OODA loop? How do you disrupt it so that they can't think? It's also very Sun Tzu, right? It's very symmetric. It's very continuous. It's not linear. And so to do that, you speed everything up. Well, if you speed everything up, you'll want to shorten the distances. You want to be unseen. We need stealth. You want to see them. You need radar. You want to hit them first. You need cruise missiles. You want to understand how to fight, you need better sensors. So all of the enabling technologies that we're trying to give the US the capacity and the capability to fight the largest enemy that we've had for 50 years, 40 years, I forget how long the Cold War actually lasted. But the way that we thought about this was, if we can get there, this is how we do it. But they realized very quickly from the cybernetics debate that they didn't have the computing power to create the thinking machine, right? They didn't have the processing power to create that AI that can understand concepts, that can think like a human. And it wasn't until the 80s, with miniaturization and with the rise of processing power, that they started to be able to get to those early foundational ideas that the cyberneticists had. And so now, Thomas's phone, I'm not going to reach between your lap to get it. Thomas's phone has more computing power than the first rocket that went to the moon. Just sitting in his lap, right? The first radar that was on a ship, big, huge radar with a 40-foot dish, had like 10 kbs, 10 kilobytes. Imagine it like so small, right? And we have so much computing power right now, and it's getting, so Moore's law says, it's going to double, and it's going to double, and it's going to double, it's going to double, it's going to go, and then it's going to run out. Maybe, maybe not. DARPA right now is working on not just miniaturization, but looking at how to make the chips themselves smarter, right? So how do you not just increase computing capacity, but how do you make the chip more flexible in how it uses its computing power? How does the chip itself adapt? Sensors as well, right? We rely so much on GPS for all of our guidance, our missile guidance, right? It all comes down. In Thomas's book, he talks a lot about missile defense. And a lot of this came out of missile defense, right? We had to guard against nuclear weapons. When Russia had nuclear weapons, we had to guard against them. We needed Nike Zeus. We needed missile defense. We needed radar. We needed bigger, longer, faster, smarter weapons. And so the missile defense debate of the 50s has influenced and continues to actually influence in very subtle and nuanced ways where we are and where I am in that room in Geneva. Because it's always in the background, right? I need to get it to be faster. I need to get it to be smarter. I need to be unseen. And maybe my adversary is trying to dupe me the whole time, right? Because war is a two-way street. And my favorite saying, right? The adversary always has a vote. So if you're trying to deceive your enemy, you're trying to get into their OODA loop, make it faster and smaller and smarter. And so that's where, with autonomous weapons, one of the operational reasons that we have this discussion is because of the anti-access area denial debate, right? If you go into a GPS denied or contested environment where all of your fancy tools that you've created over the years don't work anymore because they can't link up to the GPS satellites to get directions, what do? You're functionally blind again. You've gone to the zenith, and now you're back down into the shallows. And so if that's the case, right, what do? You turn back to technology. You make the machine do something that you need it to do without your guidance. You give it autonomy. So artificial intelligence is the way to do that. And then you say, well, to what extent? How much? Is it a swarm? Is it miniaturized robotics? Do they coordinate together? How do we do that, right? All sorts of, is it a missile? Is it a loitering missile? These are the debates that we're having now in terms of policy. And they're also going to drive, right? We have to remember that if those things come to pass, as Thomas noted, a cruise missile in the 1950s was considered an autonomous weapon. They called it, the V1 was the robot, the killer robot in Britain. And now you talk to somebody and you say, a cruise missile, and they say, that's not an autonomous weapon, that's an automated weapon. And then you say, well, okay, well, what about this capacity? What about this capacity? What about this capability? What about that capability? No, no, no. That's automated. That's not autonomous. Well, what is autonomous? It's the ability to change, adapt, learn, think. Okay. So it's adaptation, it's learning. Well, then cyber, we have these, just as a DARPA challenge, we have these working on our networks all the time. Stuxnet, adapted. It learns. So there's an autonomous weapon, right? So there's all sorts of these questions that we have to tease out, but we also have to remember, I think, the historical precedents that it is pushing and it continues to push us in certain directions. And so I think that's where Elon's worry is. I should note that I had a hand in that letter, so I'm sorry for anybody who hates that letter. But his worry is that we get too far ahead of ourselves. You delegate too much to the machine. So it's how much do you delegate and where is the balance that you strike so that they're tools that help us rather than tools that govern us. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm struck by when you were raising the issue of speed being a key attribute sought in the Cold War. That was driving much of the work or is driving much of the work at DARPA for AI applied to cybersecurity. So when they talk about the gain of a system like a Mayhem that won the challenge, it's the idea that it took tasks that took humans months and shrinks it down. Or relevant to the news of today, trying to avoid situations like where we have a breach at Yahoo in 2014 and don't detect it now. How can we apply AI to help us with that? So that speed attribute is still at the center of our thinking of why we want to hand over to technology. Thanks.
So yeah, I'm Jason Hong. I'm a professor in computer science at Carnegie Mellon University, and I've been working on privacy and security for about 15 years. There's two big trends I want to discuss with you. The first one is Internet of Things. Internet of Things is the third age of computing. So the first age of computing was basically let's make the computers work, so focused on the processors and just basic algorithms and so on. And then the second age of computing was networking. Let's connect all these computers together into a global network. And now we're entering the third age of computing, which is basically Internet of Things, ubiquitous computing, pervasive computing. Basically, we're weaving computation, communication, and sensing into the physical world. And we're starting to see a lot of these too. So we see things like the Microsoft Kinect. We have smart cars that are coming out. We also have smart homes, smart toys, even smart toilets. And I'm not sure I really want a toilet that's smarter than me. So this is one of the trends that's definitely happening. And you can think of this as sort of the logical conclusion of all this kind of automation that's happening. Now, the second trend that I find really fascinating and also worries me is one that Peter just alluded to, which is all the data breaches that are happening. So the Yahoo breach, actually, Yahoo did detect it 2 years ago, but for some reason, they held it back until just recently. So it's a little bit unclear why they did that. But if you just look in the past few years, the sheer number of data breaches out there. So there was Anthem, Sony, Target, TJ Maxx, Office of Personnel Management. Those are just the ones I can remember off the top of my head. So if we put these two trends together, it becomes really worrisome because if we have companies with millions of dollars and also with hired professionals and they can't secure their computers, what hope do we have as everyday people and furthermore as we push into this Internet of Things? All right, so let me give you a few examples of some of the things that are worrying me if we combine these trends together. So the first one is just emergent behavior. So what I mean by that is there's these systems that work together in ways that we didn't expect. So one of my friends worked at Google X, and she told me this really funny story of there was a whole bunch of these Googlers that were wearing Google Glass, and one person just wanted to annoy them. So he walked by the room and yelled out, "Okay, Glass, take a picture." And everybody Glass take a picture of each other. All right, but this is just sort of like one example of the emergent behavior that people didn't expect, and of course they're still sort of working together in weird ways. So let me give you another example of how Internet of Things might lead to really weird kinds of interactions with respect to security. So imagine you have someone who's trying to break into your home. They find a vulnerability in your smart toaster. They somehow get it to start smoking. Your smart smoke alarm detects that, and it says, OK, we need to open up the windows. And open up the windows, and now the thief can actually come in. Right? So that's sort of like an example of things that sort of work together, but in unexpected ways. And if you want even weirder ways, try throwing in a cat into this whole story, and you can imagine how that might also make things weirder. So emergent behaviors is one kind of problem with these kinds of systems as we push towards more automation. Another kind of problem is just the sheer scale of the systems. So right now in Pittsburgh, we're starting to deploy a lot of these uber smart vehicles, and they're sort of cool. You see them going around at the airport and so on. One thing that's interesting is if you combine these kinds of smart cars with another worrisome trend we've seen in cybersecurity, which is ransomware. Imagine that someone finds a vulnerability in these Uber cars, but they don't talk about it, and they wait until they become popular, and then say like 5 or 10 years from now, there's hundreds of people in the Uber cars, and they say, all right, I'm going to hold all these people hostage until the US government pays off the ransom, right? That would actually be really scary.
You're giving people some bad ideas.
No, this is pretty obvious, and anybody who looks at cybersecurity for a few seconds would recognize this.
What happened in Ghost in the Shell?
And here's another scary one. There's all these people who have medical implants inside of them. You can imagine doing the exact same thing. You hold an entire nation virtually hostage based off of this because so many people have these implants inside of them. All right, so those are sort of the nightmare scenarios. And in fact, if you saw the news this week, you might have seen how someone has actually figured out how to remotely activate the brakes on a Tesla. So they were in China, and they figured out how to do this. So this is sort of an emerging example of how something like this could actually happen. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit to talk about the AI side of things, too. One thing I do want to caution about is that AI, we often ascribe to AI a lot of things that it can't do. I think it's worth pointing out that the people who are most prominent critics of AI, so mentioned Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, and I forgot there's a philosopher, I think Bostrom, Nick Bostrom. Yeah.
Why do you call them critics?
Yeah.
Well, the thing is that because they're very concerned about the direction of AI, which I think is good, but I think it's worth pointing out that none of them have actually worked on an AI system. The only AI person I've seen that actually has been worried about this is Stuart Russell, right? And there's other computer scientists that do have worries, but not talking about it in the same way, because I think people often ascribe to AI things that it just can't do at all, and probably not in the near future. So let me give you an example of some of these exception cases. If you see a Google autonomous vehicle, I bet that if you just had a printout of a stop sign, it would stop. Right? That's sort of like a simple kind of way that it only works within the parameters of what it understands about the world. And these systems only work with the data that they're trained on. So once you go outside of that model, then they fail miserably. So another example would be the Mayhem system. It works against Unix systems and these kinds of web servers. You just change the parameters a little bit, and it'll probably be pretty useless against them. And I'm saying this because I also know the people who worked on this system, David Brumley. And again, they're working within a well-known model of how they expect things to work. And we, as computer scientists, know that these systems are very, very brittle. And once you go outside those models, they just tend to fail very miserably. And so I want to close by telling a story about hedge funds. My brother used to work at a hedge fund, and they called people who didn't know what they were doing F9s. And the reason they called them F9s was because in Excel, you have a gigantic spreadsheet, you have a mathematical model, and to rerun the model, you just hit F9. Okay? And so the reason they were making fun of these people is because they would change a few parameters in the model, hit F9. Change a few more parameters, hit F9. And basically, they didn't understand what the model was doing at all, and they're just basically praying that it would yield the right results. Now, the reason I'm cautioning you about this is because there's a lot of things that AI can't do, and that, again, we're ascribing that they can do. So that's one kind of caution, and related to what Heather was saying, too, about we have to be careful about the delegation aspect of things. If we think that the AI can do more than it can really do, that's bad. And if we think it can do less than it can really do, that's also bad, too. Right? And this is the problem that we're facing with all these autonomous vehicles, because we don't know what it is the car can and can't do. And so some people are actually sleeping while they're letting the car drive, but the cars actually weren't designed for that. That's a really bad thing to do. We should not be doing that because they're ascribing a lot more to what it can do. So we really have to understand what the models are if you're going to be using these AI systems, and we really have to be careful about the delegation in these. The danger is, again, if you're doing the sensing by itself, that's fine. If you're doing the action after a human is in the loop, that's fine. But when you're doing the sensing and the action by itself, this is where you have the false positives or the false negatives, and this is where the failure cases really are for these systems. So don't fully believe in the systems. Really understand what the models are. Don't be an F9.
Adam.
Thanks. I'll take the podium this time. Use this or just speak into mic.
We're here. You're good.
All right, so subject of my remarks today is more keyed to what Thomas talked about, the legacy of cybernetics itself, more specifically what that legacy can teach us about the policy challenges of machine intelligence in cybersecurity and other domains of human conflict. The central tenet of cybernetics in a nutshell is that the mind is a mechanism, and there is nothing necessarily mysterious about mental activities. It is an attempt to solve the mind-body problem, and a very brazen one at that. Cybernetics did not make the machine human-like. It mechanized the mind. The approach, it varied in practice. Some people tried to turn mental operations into a series of procedures, which then could be programmed in a computer. Others tried to model everything from anti-aircraft guns to organizations as goal-seeking systems. They pursue a goal and they adapt their behavior accordingly. The long-run intellectual consequences of cybernetics are supersede those distinctions, however. And it's that language and reasoning are no longer recognizably human. Time and time again, we see aspects of higher-order thinking, reasoning, and social activity that we think are exclusive to us, either conquered by machines or simply revealed to be just general properties of animal intelligence. And the long-run effects of decensuring the things that make us human can be seen in the rise of a globe-spanning machinic phylum of computers, protocols, networks, and the various agents, programs, daemons, and what you might call it, that increasingly populate them. These systems have also emerged in the shadow of an earlier species of synthetic beings, a vast, inhuman distributed systems of information processing, communication, and control called bureaucracies and markets. Those were the original artificial intelligences. The machinic phylum is not just a mere servant of our will, it is also an extension of our motivational structures and desires. So the oft-repeated claim that machine intelligence is not neutral or a function of our biases or inequalities is true, but it's also banal. Yes, it is, but so what? The mantra is that machine intelligence must be visible and accountable, but visible to who? And accountable to who? How? Much of the processes behind the decisions we make are not visible to us. Are conscious through conscious experience and are designed principally to help our genes, even at the expense of our individual well-being. The human mind is the ultimate black box, and human organizations are nothing but really, really big black boxes. By the same token, the issue of machine value alignment is also a stalking horse for the greater problem of whether or not our human institutions are aligned with our values, whatever they might be. If you look at government today, is it aligned with your values? Are corporations aligned with your values? Are legal and ethical systems aligned with your values? That's obviously a very contentious dispute, given that you can't go to Thanksgiving in this election year without getting into an argument with your relatives about so I don't think that that's going to provide any practical ideas for people in this room who have to make difficult choices about how much authority to give machines in adversarial situations, and what ought to happen and who ought to be punished if these machines exceed their authority. Perhaps, I think, by looking back at the history of cybernetics and what cybernetics was originally designed to solve, we can get more productive answers to those problems. Cybernetics and its cousins are ultimately Manichean sciences. They're developed partly out of a view of military conflict, and maybe even human existence itself, as an abstract and game-like process of competition with a logical and cunning opponent. Despite the achievements of cybernetics and other similar fields, we still really don't understand how humans make strategic decisions in adversarial situations that well. We understand how machines do it even less. Could we get better? There's a field combining psychology, neuroscience, and animal behavior called comparative cognition. You look, for example, at how human babies develop and compare it to how bird or deer babies develop. You find commonalities and variations, and you can then reason about what more general properties of intelligent development are. This helps us understand how biological intelligence develops, but also gives us some templates and guidelines for how to design synthetic intelligent systems. I think that we need comparative strategic cognition in the sense of having a field that explicitly studies how biological and synthetic intelligent systems reason in adversarial situations. Cybernetics used to be that. It was what it was during World War II and the Cold War, and that dream has been largely forgotten. My hope, I think, is that we can bring this back. And my hope is specifically that we can learn more about how both types of system, both biological and synthetic, perform tactical and strategic behavior by studying and directly comparing them. I strongly believe that this comparative study is not just an issue for cybersecurity, the Internet of Things, or autonomous weapons. I think it's the most important policy issue of my lifetime, and I hope that we can get better intuition about it both as we design autonomous systems that can fight, and as we send autonomous humans to fight, kill, and die. That's all, and thanks very much for your time.
Thank you. So we've heard about how there is this proliferation of the technology. It's being pushed by a variety of forces, historic ideas, security demands, consumer and market demands that we don't well understand. And yet we've also heard how it's not well understood. It may be misaligned with our values or what we perceive our values to be. The ideas that shape it, many of them are largely forgotten. So with all of this in place, I'm going to ask a question at my peril, which is, what do you think will be the state of this field 5 years out? Not so much where will the technology be, but what will be the kind of debates that we'll be having 5 years out, and how similar or dissimilar will they be from today? And let me sort of go down the line of that.
Well, that's a tough one, especially for me, I think, because I wrote this book. And if anything, I learned one lesson in looking at the past visions of the future, and that is that the brightest minds, one particularly comes to mind. You all know his name, Herman Kahn, who wrote on thermonuclear war. He wrote a book, less well-known but still well-known, called in 1967, called The Year 2000. Or actually, yeah, The Year 2000. So in the book, 30 years before the year 2000, he developed visions and scenarios of what would be, what would happen by 2000. And some of it is prescient, but most of it is completely off. He predicted we would treat machines like slaves, and that would be an ethical problem at this stage in time. Things like that. So basically, I'm trying to dodge the question by not.
Notice, but I'm going to push on you here. I didn't do the Arthur C. Clarke, A Generation Ahead, or 1967 to 2000. I said 5 years within the immediate planning cycle of everything from, the Pentagon to our personal lives. So I'm going to not let you get away from dodging.
Okay. Well, what I would say is the speed of innovation that we're looking at over the past 20 years is probably not a linear curve that's just sloping up. It is probably some sort of S-curve that is already in a process of slowing down again. Because think about it, what is the single most revolutionary technology that we've seen in the past 15, 20 years? Hazard a guess. What do you think? If you have to name one technology that, in terms of, that changed, that had the most significant impact, what would it be?
I'd go with internet.
The internet. Well, yeah, fair enough, but in my mind, that's sort of way earlier. I mean, in the post-1990s.
I'll go with robotics, not yet fully felt though.
So
but again, now we can get into a wonderful back and forth, because arguably the first robotic system, the first armed drone is 1918, but so there's always a pedigree to a technology.
So what I would say is, again, let's start the perspective in the 40s. The computer comes around. And first is this huge machine that's as big as a factory floor. And today it fits into a watch. So it shrunk drastically. But the one technology that had the most significant impact along the way, in my mind, is the touch screen interface. Because that enabled the last leap to go all the way down to the watch, because it's an input and output device at the same time. and it also is the fastest spreading technology probably ever, because look at how many people across the world use that technology today. Why do I mention this? Because that will probably, what we'll see is improvement in terms of automation apps, a little bit more miniaturization, but I think we may have reached a dead end in terms of miniaturization to a degree, because who wants a computer that's even smaller than a watch in everyday use? Arguably that's already too small, at least to me. So in the Pentagon, in the defense environment, I would come to a completely different conclusion. And that is, what I find most fascinating to study are the adversary responses to outsmart technology in a low-tech way. So 9/11 is an example. But also the kind of hacking operation that we currently see in order to influence the US election is an interesting response to technology, because it completely throws the adversary off on an intellectual and political way. How do you react to that? It's the equivalent to an IED. It's like it doesn't compute. How do you deal with this low tech? Because it is quite low tech ultimately threat.
Heather.
So I'm going to try to answer two questions that I think you posed. So the first is, and maybe it was one that Thomas posed. So I think the most interesting technology to come out in the last 15 years is actually CRISPR. It's not robotics, it's bio, right? I think CRISPR is going to revolutionize how we live and what we do with genomics. I think genomics is huge. So I would say that. But for this room who's interested in cyber, I would say that in the next 5 years, the state of the field is going to not change drastically. I mean, we're not going to have any sort of revolutionary, oh my gosh, this is 5 years from now, the world has changed. But what I would say is you will see subtle nuances of change. So the fundamental questions, while my colleague calls them banal, I would actually say are not banal. That value alignment and value loading, if you want to think of it that way, these are problems in AI right now, because what we know, and these are the debates that we're going to have and continue to have, and as we design systems. So the value loading problem in AI is, if you are going to create an intelligent system, an AGI, an artificial general intelligence, how do you make it comport with human values? How do you make it kind of like the man on the street? So you want it to, you don't want to have to give it every single direction. So for example, if I told my AI, go to this, go pick up my prescription, it would have to infer that it needs to go to the pharmacy. Then when it goes to the pharmacy, that it needs to obey all the traffic laws, and that when it gets to the pharmacy, it has to pay, it has to stand in line, it can't roll over the old lady, because when we're talking about these systems, they're goal-seeking, and they're going to find the fastest, most efficient way to do the task that you've decided to give it. So that would maybe blow through all the red lights, run over the old lady, steal the medicine, right? You have to make all of these constraints explicit. Or you create a learning system that you give it certain values that it understands to act in the boundaries. And those values are fundamental questions that we've been discussing, at least in philosophy, for millennia, right? What is the good life? What is the summum bonum, right? What is the best value? So I don't think that they're banal by any means. And in fact, when we talk about war, that is the ultimate debate about values, right? And so I think, again, when we talk about what tasks to give it, how to create it, those are the things that are driving our policy, are going to be driving our technology. I just got out of a meeting in The Hague with the IEEE, one of the largest organization of electrical engineers, and they know, right, there's 400,000 members, they know that they have to start talking about values to their members and maybe coming up with a code of conduct for what kinds of systems that they can build, and what kinds of values and what kinds of ethics to discuss with their members. And so I think that's going to shape the debate very much so in the next
Where do
5
you
years.
see the actual state of that debate 5 years out? So, you opened by talking about these meetings in Geneva where diplomats are gathering, and more recently you mentioned The Hague. So another way of framing this is, will the debate 5 years out that you're involved in, will the evolution of it be like what happened in, say, international diplomacy and law as it relates to the environment, where it kept getting more complex, more nuanced, more implementation? Not where we want it to be, but there's a clear advancement versus, say, for example, negotiations on the Middle East, where we just have the same conversation again, and again. Which do you think this field will look like 5 years out?
I'm really hopeful. Maybe I'm a cautious optimist, but maybe I'm a proud Kantian, right? Hope is always out there. But I'm really hopeful that because we're having these discussions now as the technology is emerging, and things like these IEEE meetings for codes of conduct or for suggestions of conduct or whatever you want to call it, that those will put into place policies and shifts. So much like we saw with biological engineering, the community of scholars said, we're not doing this, and we're going to put some limits on what we're going to do in like an LSMR. And so I think that is another way that this is you're gonna see concrete policy moving forward.
How involved is the cybersecurity community in this? Because you talked about the technology link, and yet, as far as I'm familiar, we're not seeing cybersecurity companies involved in the discussions at Geneva. The NSA it's U.S. military, not the NSA, et cetera.
Yeah, so I can't speak for the NSA. That's above my pay grade, but I would say that the companies actually are involved in a lot of these discussions. They're just not out front.
Okay, Jason.
So in 5 years, one thing I would hope to see is a smaller gap between policymakers and also the engineers. So let me give you an example using autonomous vehicles. One of the common debates you've probably seen about autonomous vehicles is the trolley problem. So if a car's about to crash, should it crash into this person over here where it might kill one, or that group over there where it might kill 5? Or should it try to, what's the value of the person's life inside? Now, if you talk to the engineers who are working in the computer systems, their debates are completely different. Their debate is, we made an error 5 seconds ago, what should we be fixing? Right? They in fact don't even talk about the trolley problem at all because they don't think it's actually that important. The important thing is, how could we have done better to have prevented this issue from happening? Let me give you another example. If you ever meet a roboticist, if you really, really want to get under their skin and just really annoy them, say, this robot should obey Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. Right? I'm absolutely serious. This will totally annoy the hell out of them. Because if you think about Asimov's laws, they're like from the Talmud, like the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not do this. The problem is that there's a gigantic gap between those policies and those rules and how do you actually build the systems? And what is the interpretation of those systems? So telling the computer, okay, it should not do this, it should preserve human life, well, it has to be programmed in, and it's really the developer that's doing that, not the robot that's doing that too. So I think that these things, we have to be careful not to have these grand debates that are really philosophical but end up not really impacting the underlying system or not giving clear guidance as to how these systems should be built. So to give a really concrete example of where I think, and I hope the debate will be in 5 years, a lot more about things like delegation. I think this point is really important. In which cases should we be delegating things directly to the computers? In which cases should we not? How do we make it much clearer to people what's being delegated and what's not? So again, using the car example, a lot of people think that it can do a lot more than it can today, but most of them can't, and that's where a lot of the problems come from. Or a lot of people think Siri can do a lot more than it can, and it can't. And so that's where you have this mismatched expectations and disillusionment because you think it's going to do a lot more than it can. So that's where I'm hoping the debate will be, something that will help the people who are building the systems a lot more.
Adam?
I think that the debate will be very much in 5 years oriented around simulation and testing. And that goes to Jason's point, and it also goes to a point that I'm going to double down on right now, which is that I do believe that ethical and value alignment debates are banal and trivial. In a sense that It's true that ethics and values are very relevant for machines. Ethics and values are also very relevant for any kind of synthetic device that humans design, such as markets, governments, or bureaucracies. But my fear is that in going down this road, we're going to simply learn what we've always known, which is that human beings are divided about what ethics and values they believe that their synthetic devices should have. Human beings tend to, those synthetic devices tend to be opaque by design, and those synthetic devices also are very complex and difficult to understand. And some entities may have specific interests in making the values they've designed those synthetic devices to obey opaque, such as Volkswagen and its defeat devices. Volkswagen tried to engineer in its cars devices that would defeat air pollution testing. It would pump out the wrong data that would indicate it was compliant during testing, and it would and then once the cars got back on the road, they would pollute as they normally would. Which brings me to my main subject, which is that all of these philosophical debates can be very abstract and will just boil down to partisan sloganeering or shouts across theological divides. In order to be able to actually talk about the policy dimensions of what values a machine has been designed with, you need data. You need to understand its behavior. And the problem is that a lot of these machines are too complex and expensive to be able to fully test in a factory. And I'll give you two representative examples of that are interesting to contrast. So I own a TurtleBot robot, which is made by ClearPath Robotics. It's not really an advanced research robot. It ranges between about $1,000 to $2,500. You can test it like Python programs with it just by having it move around and see what happens. But if you really want to get repeatable statistical experiments and under a much wider range of conditions, you have to test it in simulation. The thing is expensive, it breaks very easily, and it also has very limited battery life. There's a program called Gazebo in the robot operating system that you can use to test it under various simulation scenarios. Now, how I got here to this conference was through Uber. Uber optimizes its ride-sharing schedule through an agent-based model. They have a computer simulation of all the cars moving around in a city, and how the drivers interact with each other. Does this driver's schedule impact the other drivers driving, and so on and so on? And they're built from real data. That's because you can't perform a giant experiment in real life with all of these Uber cars. You have to test the complex system in simulation. I think that we're going to rapidly realize that a lot of these systems can only be understood through simulation, and that's going to raise a lot of important questions about how realistic the simulators are. Do they have the noise and complexities of the real world? What assumptions are they designed and built according to? What interests are the simulations used to advance? In the Cold War, wargaming and simulations were ideological tools that were used to advance different defense agendas. I think that as people begin to, as the testing demands of these systems begin to increase, we're going to see the same debates over simulation and wargaming in the Cold War reoccur over much more simpler systems that are in our houses, our cars, and other areas.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just actually to respond to something that Adam, in your initial statement, not what you just said now, but I think it's a really important statement actually, because I wrote this book with a subtitle, A Cybernetic History. Some of these ideas about machines, about artificial intelligence, historically speaking, are the ideas equivalent to TNT, if you like, to a highly dangerous and explosive material. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. When Wiener published his book, it was a runaway bestseller. Sort of it touched something in the zeitgeist. It touched something that a lot of people were thinking about at the time. L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of the Church of Scientology, of all people, read Wiener and thought, this is amazing. I can reprogram the minds of people. I'm not joking. That's why his book was called Dianetics, not, the netics is an inspiration from cybernetics. Actually, Hubbard and Wiener had a letter exchange that I managed to find in an archive. in which Wiener says to Hubbard, because Hubbard reaches out to him several times, and Wiener says, "You're a charlatan, leave me alone, do not use the word cybernetics. I forbid you to use the word cybernetics." And then he gives up. In 1960, a book is published called Psycho-Cybernetics by a plastic surgeon about it's a self-help, one of the great self-help classics. The book will outsell my book and probably your book, but I'm not so sure in that case, on any day on Amazon, because it's still today so popular. It has sold more than 30 million copies. It's ridiculous. So what I'm trying to say here is that some of these ideas are so incredibly seductive that literally cults have been made out of them. So my book is really designed a bit as a bullshit detector. And the message that I want to get across with a statement here is that let's not go back and be seduced again, not by cybernetics, and use the phrase again, because I don't want to revive it at all. It should stay dead, because it is dead today. And let's use that example of being seduced by these ideas, and let's not be seduced by the hypes of the day. The Yahoo incident is an interesting example because they call it state-sponsored attack without any evidence, and apparently there's a bit of an exaggeration there. And we see this fashion-like urge.
That was the question. This is my way of getting you to answer my question before. What then is the most seductive of the ideas right now that you worry 5 years out will be something that takes off?
No, takes off as in becomes a real thing, not just a hype.
No, either way. What is the most seductive idea that you, with your bullshit detector on, that you wrote a book about, you are most worried about today, that 5 years from now will be out there kind of in popular belief culture? What is the cult, the proto-cult to be worried about?
I mean, a lot of the AI discussion I find is a bit like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking, and I think even Bill Gates quotes that you provided in the beginning. I think they are definitely in BS terrain for me. But there are also smaller hypes, like big data. It seems is out. Not a lot of people are talking about big data anymore. It's like a chewing gum that has lost its flavor. But machine learning is now still quite flavorful. So this is an interesting debate to watch. As these expressions expand and more people use them, the community that actually started off using them, the computer scientists and the engineers, dropped them. So cyber is a great example. When I tweet, I try to avoid the word cyber.
I heard cyber is going to be big. It's the future. Someone said that.
Did you see that on the internet?
Okay.
Well, if I could answer that too. Yeah, so I think the seductive idea for me would be that AI is fair and impartial. Because we are the people who are building it. We are the ones who are feeding it data. And sometimes using the big data approach for AI is that there might also be biases in the data that we're collecting. So let me give you an example. There was actually a person who got a letter from, I think it was American Express, and said, we declined you for increasing your credit rating because people who shop at places where you shop tend not to pay. And it was nothing about this person, but it's just based on the other people's behaviors around him. The worry I have about things like this is that people might say, well, this is what the data says, but it might end up being like redlining inadvertently for race, gender, or other kinds of things. But people would say, but that's what the data says. But then there's deeper questions there about, well, how was the data collected? Where was it collected? Was it done in a fair manner? And just because the model says, you're living in a poor neighborhood, we're not going to increase your credit, is that what our value system should be? And so I think that's my big worry about this, because people just seem to think that computers are fair and impartial. No, they just run what we tell them to run, even if sometimes we don't understand what it's running.
Let me let Heather and then you. So you.
Yeah, I mean, look, forming policy is nothing but a value judgment. If you say, I'm going to create a law, I'm going to create a policy that you have to follow, that means that you should follow it. And once that S word gets in there, that's a normative word. You should do something, you ought to do something, and that's a value-loaded judgment. And so, to me, if you want to formulate policy based on whatever data that you're collecting, which I too think that the data that we collect and the data that we use for simulation, the assumptions that we make, these are all value loaded. You can't take out, I mean, I don't want to be completely post-structuralist in this, but like you can't take out the values that surround the person that is collecting the data, the training data that is selected, why this picture, not that picture. What are the, if you think you want to create an AI, you want to train it, Google, when you leave here, Google AI baby, and then just have a moment of disgust when you leave, and you're like, ooh. Because there's something kind of weird about having an artificial baby in a lab that's on a little wheelie thing that sees 3 people every day. They're probably all male. They're probably all white. And this is going to be the rearing of the AI baby. And tell me if you think that sort of learning and values that system learns in that environment with those people is going to be similar to anybody in this room that grew up with lots of different colors of people, lots of different kinds of people, social interaction, schools, play, unfairness. I talk with my daughter, we play Candyland, right? She tries to literally stack the deck that she gets the ice cream cone. And I have to tell her, that's not fair. I'm not going to play with a cheater, right? And so these are the types of values that influence policy, that influence design, that influence the tasks that we give it. Technology is not value neutral, it is value loaded. So when it comes to weapons, when it comes to simulations, when it comes to policy, when it comes to rules of engagement, when it comes to international humanitarian law, when it comes to military objectives choosing, when it comes to tactical decisions, when it comes to strategic decisions, those are influenced by our values. And we need to interrogate those values and decide whether or not, with eyes wide open, we want to make those technologies.
Adam.
I think that in my concern about the debate 5 years out is, I think, the same concern that could be said at any point in time during the period that Tom or Heather have discussed. On the one, I think that it's really a balance between finding the things that were useful about cybernetics and its descendants and also being critical about them. I think that like Tom in his book presents the cybernetics as often very much a fraud or a kind of a thing populated by quacks and dreamers. But I think that one of the problems with this interpretation is that a lot of the conclusions of cybernetics are implicitly accepted by a variety of disciplines. The discipline of cognitive science, from undergraduate teaching to PhD study, is almost entirely based around the idea of the brain as some kind of information processing system of some sort, or at least a machine of some kind in general. And in social science, many of you might be familiar with the terms bureaucratic standard operating procedures. The use of the word procedure is not accidental, because the image of the bureaucracy as a computer is what essentially created modern political science, economics, and sociology approaches to talking about institutional decision making. So on the one hand, this has been very successful. And less sort of metaphorically, a lot of the adaptation and learning ideas of cybernetics go into modern machine learning applications. And in terms of Silicon Valley money making, nothing succeeds like success, whatever the intellectual debates or disputes or sordid history of it might be. On the other hand, I fear that there's an aspect of being human that a lot of these theories miss, which is our capacity for reflective self-awareness, our social grounding, and our personal identities. Those are the kinds of things that are not really interesting to computer scientists in general, but they also are a very big picture of what constitutes everyday intelligence for us Homo sapiens. So I think that it's kind of a balance between trying to acknowledge where a lot of these ideas have merit and have led to tremendous scientific and technical advances, and also where they need to be also critically questioned no matter how much money they're making Google or Facebook.
Cool. Okay, let's open it up to the audience here. raise your hand, wait for the mic to come, and if you could stand and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Mark McCarthy. I'm with a trade association here in town, the Software and Information Industry Association. And I wanted to pick up on the comment that, Jason, that you made about the fairness, impartiality of AI systems. I think we want them to be fair. We want them to be impartial. We don't want them to be biased or violate the non-discrimination laws. But it won't happen automatically. It's the kind of thing that has to be done intentionally, deliberately, and on purpose. It's got to be done through design and auditing. And I just put out an op-ed today, which I'll send around to some of you, calling for the tech industry to get together with other stakeholders to help design a framework for responsible use of these kind of algorithms, precisely to help avoid the problems that might result if people do not pay attention here and really try to design the fairness in. That's one comment. The second one is the comments you made about the Defense Department and the use of AI in warfare made me think that there's a larger question here, which is the use of AI in the general workplace and the future of work. Everybody talks about how many jobs might be automated here. We're having a lot of talk about that. But there's no question it's going to change what work is like, the skills that are needed, what the interaction is between people and machines. Just think of the medical profession. What Watson can do these days might be the kind of thing that would change the connection between the doctors and the nurse practitioners and how many doctors you need. And all those kind of changes in the workplace are things we have to start thinking about and planning for. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what we need to do in that area of the future of work.
I'll let Jason hit on first because it was a reaction.
Oh, yeah. So one thing I would also add is that in some cases, I think computers and AI systems can be fairer than people can. So for example, there's a study about Israeli judges who are doing parole, and they found out that after lunch, they were much more lenient. And that's an example of a bias that we have to be careful of. But again, there might be other kinds of biases, again, based off of the data. Speaking to your second point about the future of work, this is something that a lot of people I know around in computer science, human-computer interaction, groupware fields have been looking a lot at. One of the worries is that it is going towards very low-end kinds of skills for some of these things. For example, crowd-based work is a big worry. On the other hand, I think that there is a lot of potential for vastly improving things too. So for example, with the doctors, I'm not sure how many doctors or how many patients a doctor can see in their lifetime. I would guess maybe say 10,000. But if you look at AI records or AI analyzing records, it can actually analyze millions of these records and be able to start saying, well, this reminds me of these 100 people, and this was their trajectory, and this was their outcome after these treatments. And then a doctor could actually use that in combination with their own skills and be able to get better care. But then it also raises new questions, like what is the role of doctors in this kind of world? In fact, if you want to broaden this question, what is the role of teachers in a world with Khan Academy? It's the same thing. So it's not really clear yet. It could be that it is the softer side of things, which computers are really bad at. So the emotional connection, the inspiration, and the cheerleading, that could be definitely one aspect. But I would also say, again, don't be an F9 here. You have to really make sure that you don't just fully rely on these models, because the easy thing to do is, well, this is what the computer says, let's just do it. In fact, one of my colleagues, he has been studying doctors, cardiologists, who have been using these kinds of computer assistants. And one thing he said I thought was really funny is that the cardiologists are really arrogant. They have to be, because it's the field they're in, and you have to get used to failure and still survive. And they actually tend to discount a lot of what the computer says anyways. So you also have to keep that in account as you're building these kinds of systems. Like, who are you designing for? What is their value system? And what kinds of information do they need? How do they make decisions? And so on.
I think that one practical thing that will matter for a lot of the issues of justice and fairness is first agreeing on what model interpretability is. There was a recent paper by Zachary Lipton that talked about how computer scientists and laymen have very, very wildly differing ideas of what it means for a model to be transparent and fair. That may reflect different perceptions as well as institutional interests. The second part is also developing tools that allow for more transparency. Current machine learning systems are not necessarily as transparent as AI expert systems. That's because, but AI expert systems are more narrow. They can give you but they can give you an exact trace of the exact reasoning that they did in formal logic to perform a task. Whereas you have much better, good luck on getting that out of a deep learning network. So those two things will help a lot. I think that a larger question is also the integration of political theory and normative issues with the technical side. Karl Marx read Babbage's writings and annotated them vividly. I think that there's a lot of a inherent perception that certain technology are inherently linked to certain political outcomes, whereas the technologies are very flexible and compatible with a lot of different political ideologies and needs. It's just a question, needs. It's just that those actual ideological and political questions have to be put up front, as opposed to hunting for some sort of inherent political quality of the machines.
I'm struck by the idea of, as Jason's answer, right now, it is better at helping us to detect human bias than the other way around. Whether it's the example you gave of judge sentencing, whether they've eaten lunch or not, to what we're seeing in terms of policing. Really what's happening there is it's the detection of anomalies. And you can quickly see the parallel over to the application in the cybersecurity world. But when you're thinking about detecting bias, whether it's a human, whether it's a machine, there's different types of bias. There's mirroring. You're just like me, or I want you to just be like me. There's anchoring. These are my assumptions. This is the way the world works, and I never change, or the system never changes its assumptions. That's a different bias from availability. This is the information I have, and therefore the world works this way only because I have this set of data. And again, we can see that kind of bias being built into ourselves and our markets and our policing to cybersecurity. But I go back to that idea, to the second part of your question. So far, it's been very good at finding anomalies. That's the power of this being applied to cybersecurity when you think about being, monitoring, when you think about bug hunting. Many of these tasks that require humans right now and large amounts of their time can and will be automated. The question for the cybersecurity field is, does our training match that right now? Are we creating certificates for people who can do a certain class of work that's very soon going to be made outdated by systems like Mayhem rather than the other modes and requirements in the field? Let's give someone else a chance to ask a question. Over here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Jeremy Vaughn. I'm the Navy Fellow over at the Washington Institute. And I worry about the F-9s in warfare. So for example, North Korea has a nuclear weapon, unsure on how capable that nuclear weapon is. Ballistic missile defense is now going to be a much bigger deal. There is a new article out, technology exists that allows us to do over-the-horizon control of drones via cell phone towers. So with that kind of technology existing, we are at the high end of that technology, and we tend to dismiss other nation states that have technology that's lesser than that, but it can be very effective. So your example, Heather, on CRISPR is what brought this to my mind. Now you can do genetic modification in your garage. So what teeth do we need to give the Hague or some sort of international organization to control these types of technologies so that when autonomy, we may be at the high end of that, someone gets a three-quarter solution to that and F9s it, how do we trace that back, transparency, and then hold that accountable? What do we need at the Hague in order to do that, or some other organization? Thank you.
So, yeah. It's not just the Hague, right? So, I mean, what I would say is that it has to be a top-down and a bottom-up approach. And that top-down governance is not everything, right? We tend to think in the West, especially in the United States, right, it's kind of this executive, top-down, get a law, people follow it. And I don't think is the right approach. What you need is kind of two things happening simultaneously. You need the engineers understanding what they're building and building for safety, right? You need fail-safe type systems. You need them to make those value determinations while they're designing. You know, the article that just went out the other day, yesterday I think it was, that some researcher is, you know, fiddling with human embryos. And that's something that, you know, I think should really give strict pause. And you go, what? Right? Those are the kinds of value decisions that researchers and research communities need to imbue, right? So that they're creating new students. You know, it starts with kind of enculturation through doctoral students, through mentorships, through apprenticeships, things like that. So that has to be a bottom up. Science and technology has to be also, they can't say like that's a philosopher's problem. You know, it needs to be like up front and center. There needs to be humanities and value teaching to engineers. And that's the thing that's happening at The Hague, right? So that's what that meeting was about. So that's a bottom-up approach. But then there needs to also be top-down. And that's where I think that, you know, Peter and I's article in Wired and talking about how you can do norm formation internationally and how the US can really lead on this. That the next administration can take a lead and say, like, you know, we're going to formulate good policy. We're going to fix the policy that we have. There's some shaky bits to it. We've already been leading by having a policy. We're only, you know, there's only 2 states in the system that have policies on autonomous weapons. So we're already leading on that. So we should continue. We should really push forward, and we should do norm formation for use. You know, the disarmament community trying to, you know, preemptively ban autonomous weapons, you know, they may or may not succeed, but the norm creation, the taboo that's starting to arise around, you know, autonomous killing of civilians, right? That's another type of thing where you say, maybe there's some uses you don't use those weapons for that task. You know, maybe this is an autonomous sub hunter that's only looking for, you know, subs or something like this, right? But you're not using this against, it's not anti-personnel, right? So I think those are the types of norms and generations that the top-down can do, you know, through law, through policy, and through norm formation. But then their bottom-up has to be through the engineers and the designers and the cultures and the norms that they want to instill in their people who are designing it, and designing it for the 18-year-old grunt who's not going to understand the complexity of the system.
You look like you want to weigh in.
Yeah, but Ian also. No.
Go for it, and then we'll get Ian.
Okay.
You traveled further.
Not today, I'm sure. I'd like to respond to your question actually about how the changing nature of the workplace. I'll go completely against the grain and try to provoke every single person in the room. This Department of Linguistics at Stanford, I mean linguistics, not computer linguistics, called computational languages, or however it's called, I think they're different names, has 7 undergraduate students today, 7. But the computer science equivalents of, how would that be called, the language processing?
Computational linguistics.
Yeah, that's what I assumed. They literally have thousands of applicants. Now, you know, forgive my provocation, but we run the risk as a society of intellectually impoverishing the next generation. I'll say it provocatively. Studying computational linguistics relates to linguistics of a more philosophical bent. It's a bit like sanctified plumbers that we're developing. Now, you know, my brother's a plumber. I have the highest respect for all disciplines of engineering. I spent more time among engineers and computer scientists than I spent among political scientists or philosophers today, right? But to put it bluntly, learning Python is easier than learning Plato. And it's just really important for a society to keep this realistic understanding of how complex human systems are, how difficult it is to come to political decisions. Take the attribution discussion in cybersecurity. How do you find out who attacked a specific network? It is sometimes ridiculously simplified because people assume that you can do attribution by computer script almost, that the evidence has to be, that it works like running a script and there's only one clear, free of doubt outcome. But the reality of all intelligence assessments, of all political decisions, is it's messy, you have to make judgments based on incomplete information, etc. So I would encourage, actually, future of the workplace. The most inspiring conversations that I have is with people who have maybe a little bit of a technical background, but predominantly another background. So I think it's important to keep that.
I think you actually unintentionally bridged to the prior question on the military future, because we have seen how, whether it is the context of war to the technology itself and adversary behavior with it, changes the requirements that we place upon officers and our ideal of an officer. So, for example, the operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, we saw a heightened need for troops that had a good human touch, that could interact well with local populace, that spoke local language, that understood culture, sociology, as opposed to merely precision targeting. Similarly, if we're thinking about the skill set of what we want out of a pilot, it's changed from physical ability, quick reaction time, and uber confidence, Maverick in Top Gun, to use a trope, versus now, even in a manned system, it's more about, you talk to an F-22 pilot, they are in a managerial role because the machine, and then we can have how much of it is AI or not, is making most of the old decisions that the human did on the technical kind of skill set, but we're needing the human for questions like, how do I move other systems around, to what are the proper rules of engagement, should I fire or not, as opposed to can I find them or not. And I think, again, that's what I was getting at with cybersecurity. The skill sets that we want out of people may be changing, whether it's the basic technical requirements. If you think about attribution, right now you need to have a knowledge of geopolitics to do good attribution. You need to understand the context of, why is it that Russia may be interested in my organization, not just merely what happened in the script. Let's give Ian a chance to join in.
Hi, I guess at some level this is a workforce development issue. By background, I'm a historian, and I'm fascinated about this use of history to inform future thinking on these issues. So I'd like to ask Thomas and potentially the rest of the panel, based on the research you've done, where do you think insights are informing sort of the future or the current even debates? And what ought we to be doing to encourage more sort of looking back to the past to help us understand how we get through some of this thinking?
So you mean how to trigger more interest in history of technology, for instance? Yeah. This is a tricky question to ask me because I find it so fascinating already. So do more of it. I mean, right now I'm doing a lot of work on the history of encryption, the political history of encryption. And I mean, I can't, looking at the 1990s and the debates on cyberspace and cryptography, cyberspace is a very 1990s expression ultimately, and how to secure cyberspace and keep the feds out by erecting a cryptographic wall that they can't breach. It blends into sci-fi. It has this amazing 1980s aesthetic everywhere. I mean, how can you read, say, Mondo 2000? Does anybody know what Mondo 2000 is in this room? A couple of people. Sort of a 1980s, early 90s pop, magazine, glossy, full of, drugs, tech, sex. It's, you know, it's really exciting. I mean, how can you not be interested in it? So do more of it.
Adam.
I'll say that going back to one of Tom's more insightful comments of this panel, one of the best ways to think about getting insights is really the balance between exploiting new tools but also not being seduced by them. Like Jason, I believe that actually getting hands-on experience with a lot of these systems is really important. That's why the thing I'm most looking forward to all this year is getting my hands on one of those new Pascal GPUs from NVIDIA so I can build a machine learning rig. I want the Titan X, just need to save up for it. And I also work with robots, for my PhD coursework, I build computer simulations. So I think that a lot of these things help people get a feel for how a lot of these technologies work in a very intuitive way. You can also see their limits and get a feel for what their limits are. On the other hand, there's sort of a risk on one hand of our policy debates being delegated to a technological high priesthood, and also the larger risk of our discussions about war and conflict being seduced by a cult of technology. Like Thomas, I'm a hardcore Clausewitzian. I actually have a Clausewitz T-shirt that I wear around. And like that, I think that you have to be able to be very fluent and conversant in military history and the big ideas behind strategy, and that really comes into also understanding not just how things change, but also how they stay the same. The attribution example is very good. People are surprised that sub-rosa clandestine covert activity tends to be sub-rosa clandestine covert activity. It's used with different tools, but the same general problems of it being ambiguous and also at such a low level that the state does not want to respond have not really essentially changed. It's important to be able to talk about new technologies and how they work, but you have to be able to see that they're also being driven by existing social and political structures and debates that will be around, that have been around forever and will be around long after you, me, and everyone we know and care about die.
We've got two folks from universities here. So Ian asked a question, but we kind of went at it in the opposite manner. He asked, how do we bring history, and we could say more broadly, the humanities, social sciences, into a technology debate? But for both of you, you've gone in the opposite direction, right? So you started out, for example, with an interest in political science, and then you said, I'm feeling that I want to become more engaged with technology, and I'm weaving it into my work. So I'm going to come at it the opposite way. How do we get the technology side to be the computer science students you're working with? How do we get them interested in making the journey in the opposite direction, which is, I think, really what Ian's getting at, which is how do we get it injected into that community? Yeah.
So I luckily don't have to do this anymore. Maybe it's not luckily, but I should delete that. I don't teach anymore. But when I did teach, so I just do research now, but when I did teach, I'd have to always teach the history of political thought, right? And so, because I'm a political scientist by training, and I do methods, IR, and political theory. And then I've had to learn the tech. So I'm coming at it from like learning the tech side. So I'm always trying to inject interest in the history of political thought. And if you do this to a crowd of 300 undergraduates who are probably hungover and don't want to be in your lecture, and they certainly don't want to be writing anything down. They just want, they want to be on their phones or something. You have to make it interesting, right? And so one of the ways that I think we can inject this interest in the history of ideas into a lot of things is actually through pop culture. And so when I teach the history of Western political thought, every single figure that I use, I link them to some sort of pop culture event that they'll understand. My favorite is The Matrix, the ultimate cybernetic, right? The ultimate cybernetic film. But it's also so Nietzschean, right? It's Nietzsche. It's the Übermensch, right? It's the rising above. It's the, I don't need your rules. I don't need anything. I am the Superman, right? And so, you know, Tyler Durden is the ultimate Ubermensch. And to get into that, right, you also have to say, but it's not just Nietzsche, it's Plato too, right? It's the cave, it's the Enlightenment, it's seeing with the, you know, the red pill or the blue pill, right? There's all sorts of things that you can delve into this movie that you can watch, that you can see and you can touch, and then you can pull out all of the history and all of the political theory that comes into it. And so I think that's a way that, you know, you can really get, in sci-fi, I don't actually read sci-fi because I find that it clouds my thinking on like the real technology that's in front of me. But you know, sci-fi is so present in like engineering communities and everything else. So using that and saying, hey, you know, this also has histories in political thought and in longer ways that you know. And that is a way to say, now maybe you should go read Plato or Aristotle, or hey, by the way, Kant, FYI, Clausewitz loved Kant. In fact, if you read On War, it is nothing but a treatise on the First Critique. And it is about the phenomenal and the noumenal. It is war as we know it in reality versus war as the ideal in theory. And he's emulating Kant. So you might want to get a Kant t-shirt.
Okay, so Jason, but I'm going to preface this by giving a personal story. So as Ian mentioned, I wrote a book called Wired for War about the world of robotics. And I gave a speech at your university many years back, and a professor came up to me afterwards, very angry, and said, I don't appreciate you troubling my students by asking them to think about the ethics of their work. And what he was getting at was the idea that he just wanted them to build the technology, focus on that, and not self-question. And I was struck and almost appreciative for that anecdote. So how do we deal with that? How do you try and bring in these topics into the technology space?
I'm actually curious as to who the faculty was, but I'll ask you afterwards. Well, one thing that we do have at Carnegie Mellon, but this is primarily for our university, is that every computer science student has to have a major or a minor outside of the department. Now, most of the students do take one of the hard sciences, so like math or statistics, but there are a fair number that do take courses, other kinds of courses. So I do remember there's one fantastic student went off to Google. He minored in music. There's other ones that also did history and other fields too. And in fact, I think another way of looking at this too is in my field is really unusual in computer science. It's human-computer interaction. There's designers sitting next to psychologists, sitting next to computer scientists, and we tend to draw in people from all kinds of fields too. So we have many people from psychology. We also have chemical engineers and mathematicians that are coming.
But Ian's going to push back and say those are all social sciences of some kind, not humanities.
Yeah, so Carnegie Mellon might not be the best place to answer that question too, I would say.
That's not true. So the head of the Department of Philosophy is David Danks is a friend of mine, and he is a psychologist and a philosopher, and he does machine learning, and so he's
Richard Chinders
the enigma.
Richard Chinders was the former head of the philosophy department, and he also does Bayesian and also Bayesian mathematics, and also looking at how you do explanations of what's going on with your models too. I think there's definitely elements of that. I think the best way to really convince technical people about this is to tie it in with really big ideas. So things that inspired Steve Jobs, or things, there's a reason why so many people admire him. It's not just because of innovation, but because he tied it in with really big trends. When he was giving his graduation speech at Stanford, talking about the beauty and aesthetics and calligraphy and exploration of things too. I think tying it into this really big ideas of, say, privacy or even war, things like that, I think people will really resonate with that because these are things that they're immediately facing with, and things that they can immediately appreciate. So the issues of Facebook and privacy, for example, and then what's the longer history behind that. Or even like, with the languages and how you can even look at, not just the formal languages of programming, but also how some of those things might have influenced the programming languages that we deal with today. A lot of them actually were based on some of those theories, especially like Chomsky as well too. So starting from, here's what we know and bridging out from there, But the problem is that that does require a lot of domain knowledge about what the computer scientists know and also what the kids are really interested in today. And that's really the challenge, because right now the departments are very siloed, and even though Carnegie Mellon has the lowest barriers to entry for collaboration I've ever seen, each department still comes up with its own curriculum, and they don't really collaborate with each other to try to figure out how to integrate these better. But that's just a universal problem with education.
Okay, Adam, you want to jump in?
I think that one of the most important things for getting people who are not interested in the sort of stuff interested in is exploring the context of ideas and of the big ideas and analogies and how analogies between them. For example, and Clausewitz is actually a common misperception that he was a German idealist. He wasn't. It's very hard to describe his philosophy in any single way. One of the best books about it is Peter Perret's The Cognitive Challenge of War, which talks about Clausewitz's struggle as a young officer to be able to come up with a new strategy for defeating France after the crushing defeat by Napoleon. And it talks about how it was a freewheeling and intellectual open context in which people like Clausewitz would go to lectures from philosophers, but they'd also go to lectures by the leading mathematicians and scientists of the day. And they created eclectic philosophies and ideas that really cannot really be reduced to simple, like Clausewitz was an Xian or Thatian. Or Thatian. It was a product of a very particular and interesting intellectual context. I bring up that example very much because I think that when people are approaching these problems, they can go back and see how people before them have dealt with them in the past, and the kind of challenges they faced, and the various things that influenced them. Like military officers today who read these stories about Clausewitz, the young officer, can connect it to their own struggles. I personally think that whenever I have difficulties thinking about how I can reconcile the things I did, like the things I did in a historical or political science vein in the past, and how I use technical tools to accomplish that, I read back and look at the story of Herbert Simon, who learned to write his first computer program at age 39, at a day in which computers were room-sized entities, and where if you dropped room-sized entities. And he also faced similar struggles in being able to reconcile interesting ideas about humans and mechanical tools he was using to explore them. I think that really for trying to get people who are not interested in the humanities to be able to think about that, you really have to just sort of appeal to the challenges that they're facing and then talk about the history of other people who dealt with them and the ideas that inspired them. And chances are you'll often find that even that those people had a very rich humanities background. Norbert Weiner's book, God and Golem Inc., which is, I think, which is his talk about when religion impinges on cybernetics, about when the idea of technology becoming a cult, that's replete with all kinds of philosophical and historical references. Even at one point, he analogizes the process of human and machine interaction to the idea of a game played with God. And he goes in and he does a very detailed textual exegesis of the Bible. A lot of these people who came up with these ideas, that's what they were reading. And I think the best way to often convince people that those ideas are worth talking about is simply to say, Norbert Weiner had time for history, the Bible, and philosophy and humanities. Why don't you?
Last question over here in the front.
Hi, I'm Jack Krapansky, a former software developer. Back to the 5-year question, I'm wondering if your panelists can look at the question of, in 5 years, will we hit the point where the complexity of our systems, the individual systems and the interaction between the systems, plus emergent behavior and this simulation angle that we can't know by looking at it, we have to simulate it, will we finally reach the point in 5 years where we can no longer do traditional security analysis? Or maybe the question should be, will we hit the point where the security analysis is much more consuming than the actual underlying system implementation? That you spend more time doing security than the actual coding?
Well, I would say that the complexity point, we already passed that many, many years ago, because the sheer the sheer complexity of the system. So for example, there's this really beautiful paper by Ken Thompson. It's called Reflections on Trusting Trust. And the basic question is, what do you trust inside of a system? And he talks about how you could have modified the compiler, the part where you translate the programming language into a program that you can run. That if you don't trust the compiler, then you're sort of in trouble there, because you could actually have modified it so that it outputs bad code, but backdoors and other things. But you can also go back even further. Do you trust the silicon chips that are there? There's this one person at Carnegie Mellon who's studying how do you know if these chips are legitimate or not. It turns out that the military has bought lots of chips that turned out to be fake, or they had backdoors built into them already too. But you can do that at every single scale, and eventually you're just going to have to figure out what is your risk model, and are you more interested in trying to prevent the problems from happening or detect and respond? So an example for detection and response is sort of like how the credit cards work. They assume that a certain percentage of people are going to get their credit cards compromised, and they just say it's cost of doing business, and they keep on going. But in other cases, clearly the prevention is much more important too, so state secrets and other kinds of things. But again, I would say we're well past that point already, and we definitely need new kinds of techniques and new ways of trying to protect the systems. This is where I think AI really will be the future for cybersecurity, because we can start trying to build better models of what's normal and not. We can start trying to do better pattern detection. And with all the sensor data, we can also do smarter things too. So for example, it looks like you're trying to log in and you're from Brazil, but we've never seen anyone from Brazil log in before. Or in your home system, it's like, hey, 99.999% of your transactions have never gone to Russia, but sometimes, for some reason, you seem to be contacting this Russian server. We're going to need systems like that to really help us, because the sheer complexity is well beyond what any humans can understand anymore.
I think there are two technical things that correspond very narrowly to your question. The first is the bigger question of how useful formal methods will be for verifying the behavior of these systems. For those who don't really know, in computer science, formal methods are the use of mathematical logic to verify that the program does what it's supposed to do. And the problem is that formal methods are can only at best be used to verify the parts of whether a complex systems behave as they should. And when it comes to emergent behavior, which Jason has talked about, there's a lot of research by people, especially by a woman named Joanna Bryson at the University of Bath, that cast doubt on whether formal methods are ever going to be able to show whether the emergent behavior can be provably correct. That's going to be a very big debate that anyone interested in the technical side should be should be watching. The second part is the issue of how to break these systems, how to make them fail and show how they can fail. There's another paper that Heather Roth references in her work called The Psychopathology of Autonomous Cybersecurity Systems, that is basically takes a look at, human beings have pathologies and psychological issues. If you were going to be playing a machine psychologist, what kind of ways in which can machines go awry or misbehave? And that paper just stems from the basic premise that all systems are very limited, and the system processes are competing for these limited resources, and conflicts between different behaviors and processes for those resources are going to be the things that are going to be causing a lot of the errors in autonomous systems. In a very crude way, in a sense, you could say it's just a generalization of thrashing in operating systems, albeit extended to minds.
Heather, do you want to weigh in?
Oh, no, I think.
Is this the final?
This is the final. So Heather, that was if you
Oh,
want a
sorry.
final word.
Kind of tired.
Oh,
I need another cup of coffee. Yeah, so I think that I completely agree with Jason that we've surpassed complexity a long time ago on this side, and AI is the only way that we're going to figure out how to deal with our increasing inventions, frankly. The Internet of Things, we're going to have so many billions of new devices, and the users coming online, by 2020 we're going to have even more users. I forget the exact number. I just wrote a paper, so I'm shameless at forgetting the exact number. But all of these new users are also going to be coming from the internet are going to be coming from moderate economy states, so Brazil, many in Latin America, some in Africa, And so you're going to have a lot of people online, a lot of new people online with probably not very tech-savvy devices. In the West, we're going to have the Internet of Things and more gadgets. And so the explosion of all of these devices is going to require very, very smart AI to patrol. Without it, and thank God you're working on encryption. And we really need better encryption. Hopefully, I say hopefully that no one is going to get a quantum computer to just make it all useless. So, but yeah, that's kind of what I'm hoping.
So let me use your question to make a somewhat chilling observation at the end. The US election setup that will become so important in very few weeks basically consists of approximately 9,000 different local, county, and precinct level elections. The system is extraordinarily complex. Even people running it have limitations in terms of how well they understand it, I'm told. The US intelligence community, there was a recent assessment that's not made public yet of the security of the electoral system, assesses that the complexity of the system itself ultimately increases its resilience because there's no single point of failure. Now, some of you may feel good about this now, but let me zoom out and highlight why the human aspect and the sort of larger political features are so crucial on the evening of November 8th. Donald Trump has repeatedly said that the election could be rigged, right? Now, think about that statement just for a moment, what it implies. It implies probably that he's at least considering, or he may consider on the evening, late night, on November 8th, not to concede immediately like Mitt Romney did 4 years ago, like John McCain did 8 years ago. Not conceding means that he's opening a fascinating and scary opportunity for those who are trying to meddle with the election. So if you're looking at this situation from a Russian intelligence point of view, you don't really need to attack a couple of thousands of these precincts or voting machines. The only thing you need is possibly cast doubt on the outcome in Pennsylvania, where I think in approximately 40-something precincts, there's no paper trail available. Now, they don't need to hack anything. The question is, can you credibly inject doubt into this politically very difficult, uncertain moment if it emerges? And the answer is, it's thinkable. It's not unthinkable that this could happen. So here you have an example of a cyber attack, quote unquote, if you like, that is very low tech, but possibly extremely effective.
And that's classic Russian psyops.
So with that wonderful, happy note to end on, but again, it actually, I think, hits where we began, which is the combination of the excitement, but also the concern and the worry over this, and the ability to deal with large amounts of information with speed, but also we move into systems that we don't well understand, and or they reflect our biases, or we think we understand them better than they actually do, which, as you've heard from the panel, these are all the things that surround us when we talk about this topic. So I very much appreciate the panelists for joining us, all of you for coming out. Let's give them a hand.
Thank you.